sorry it's been a while. It's Jess here, and I was hoping to talk about the books I've read over the last few months. I got myself a matcha to motivate myself to make this video, but it doesn't taste that good. It's a yuzu sparkling matcha, but I can taste the yuzu syrup down the bottom and it doesn't taste very good. I kind of have purchase regret. Anyway, the first books I wanted to tell you about are actually the first two books in a series. So the first book is called My Brilliant Friend, and then the second book is The Story of a New Name, and I have two different I guess editions, so they don't look matching, but they're the first and second books in the Neapolitan novels written by Elena Ferrante and translated from Italian. And these books are just so well written, and if you take any recommendation from this video, let it be these. They follow the lives of these two girls who are growing up together in Naples in the 1960s, and it follows them from childhood into young adulthood, and then there's two more books that I haven't read yet, but I think it goes until they're in their 50s or 60s. There's this quote on the back of this novel that says, "Ferrante writes with the kind of power saved for weather systems with female names, sparing no one." And I feel like that quote really stuck with me as I read through it because it is really powerful writing. The relationship between these girls is just really interesting. It's really dynamic. Sometimes it's mature, sometimes immature. There's a whole spectrum of emotions that I guess are explored within the books. It's definitely a character-driven novel, not plot-driven. A lot happens, but because you feel like you're kind of living a life and so much time passes and there's so much detail, you're left not with a clear timeline or pattern of events, but more of an impression. And it does feel like the way that you look back on a certain period of your life and you think that period felt like this. You can say that about whole chunks of the books. I would say it's definitely worth trialing at least the first book, and if you don't like it, then the writing style is not for you, but if you love it, then you've got 4 books to enjoy. The only thing I would say, the only con, is that it is very long and detailed, and I knew I had to read both books in close succession to each other, otherwise I would forget a lot of detail. And in fact, there's an index of characters at the start of the first book, and it gets updated at the start of the second book. The index of characters shows you like all the families in the neighborhood and tells you a little bit of their relation to each other as well. And I had to reference this a lot as I was reading through. I had to keep being like, whose family was that again? Eventually it does stick, but it took quite a lot of focus, I guess, to follow the stories of the minor characters. And that would be my only con of the book, is that it's quite long and detailed, and you kind of have to commit to sitting down and reading it in order to get the most out of the story. But I would highly recommend these novels, and let me know if you've read them and what you thought. Staying on the theme of fiction, the other fiction book I read this month was My Husband's Wife by Alice Feeney. I borrowed this from the library. I really don't have much to say about it. I don't remember much from the plot. It was one of those books that's an easy read, has lots of plot twists, and I enjoyed it at the time, but it really doesn't leave much of an impression. And I have dipped my toe into this like popular thriller genre once or twice before, and it always is kind of appealing at the start, and there's a lot of mystery and you wonder how it's all going to fit together. But to me, reading one of those feels a little bit like watching a trashy TV show. Like, you enjoy it at the time, and it serves its purpose in that way, but you're not going to take that much away from it. And now, like a month on, when I think back, I really can't recall much about the book. So I read that, I gave it 3 stars. Okay, moving into memoirs now. So I have 2 memoirs that I read, and both were quite interesting. So the first one I want to talk about, and I would definitely recommend if you haven't read this, it's called Educated by Tara Westover. This was actually my second time reading this book. I read it maybe 3 years or so ago. And if you don't know, it's about Tara. It's written, and it's a true story of her life growing up in quite an extreme Mormon family in rural Idaho or Utah. And they live on a farm. They live very much kind of off the grid, disconnected from much of their extended family. The kids are not enrolled in school, and they pretty much avoid association with any government or healthcare agency. The book kind of explores her life growing up and some of the, I guess, extreme beliefs that I don't think are necessarily mainstream Mormon beliefs that kind of dictated their lives, and then her experience as she goes on to get a tertiary education as an adult. And that's why the book's called Educated. And I guess she has to rethink and challenge everything she believed growing up. And it's really moving because she speaks with quite nuanced tone about the love and the loyalty that she feels for her family, but then reconciling that with, I guess, the ways that they impacted and abused her growing up. But I will say that some of the descriptions of violence and abuse were quite intense at times, so just keep that in mind. Editing Jess here, still with my matcha, doing some same day editing, look at me go. I don't think I captured in what I was talking about how well written and educated it is. And the fact is that Tara Westover did not have a primary school or a high school education. Like, she taught herself how to write and then ends up going on to not only a college in the US, but one of the best universities in the world. I won't spoil it, but you just have to read it to experience how wonderful her writing is. She's truly a very talented person. The other aspect of the book, which is crazy, is that you spend the whole time like with this sense of anticipation of what is it going to be like when she experiences the real world. And it's just crazy to put yourself in her shoes, I guess, and imagine what it would be like to suddenly encounter at the age of 18 what it's like to have any independence or learning about world history for the first time. Okay, the next book I have to talk about is another memoir, sticking with the theme, and this one is The Trauma Cleaner. And it's written about a woman named Sandra Pankhurst, but it's written by Sarah Krasnostein. And this book was really fascinating and somehow also boring, and I'll explain why. So The Trauma Cleaner is a biography about Sandra Pankhurst, who is a trans woman who has since passed away, but at the time of writing the book was working as a trauma cleaner. And a trauma cleaner is essentially a specialized cleaning service that deals with hoarding, human waste, like death, whether it's homicide or suicide, like mold or pest infestations, like really extreme cleaning situations. So the book alternates between telling her life story and then descriptions of the cleaning jobs. I found her life story to be very like compelling and sad and gripping. She grew up with a very traumatic childhood. It kind of talks about her young adult life, and then eventually she became a drag queen, worked as a sex worker, and then how she eventually pivoted out of that career into she was a funeral director and then eventually into trauma cleaning. And it's her story, but in some ways it's a more general story because she actually is unwell at the time of writing the book. And so as much as the author tries to get kind of accurate facts and details from Sandra, she doesn't have a great memory of those years. And so in some ways it's a more general story of people who lived a similar life to her in that era. For example, historical sources about sex work in Kalgoorlie in Western Australia, which is one period of the book. And so while I think it's an attempt to be an accurate description of her life story, she's an unreliable source. And so some parts of it feel slightly ingenuine, but it's overall quite well written and interesting. And then there's description of the cleaning clients, which is mainly people with hoarding disorder. And it kind of shows how Sandra has such an excellent, like, compassionate and non-judgmental approach to these jobs. But it kind of ends up just being quite tedious to read these descriptions of these houses over and over again. And it tries to, I guess, provide a human face to the hoarding and share some of the people's life stories. But because there's only one chapter dedicated to each house, it ends up feeling a little bit shallow. I'm not sure it quite has the intended effect. So I kind of lost interest in those parts, but I found Sandra's life story very interesting. So I think if these themes interest you, it was worth a read. But I would say to check the trigger warnings, and I'll put a list of them here because it was a really intense and quite graphic book at times and sad, like hard to read at times. So keep that in mind. Then the last book I read, this was a Christian book, and this is Praying with Paul by Carson. And this book uses the prayers written by the Apostle Paul in various of his letters in the Bible, and it uses them to kind of branch off and touch on the theology of prayer more broadly. I really enjoyed this book. I found it very like uplifting and challenging to think about Paul's model of prayer. Some of the different aspects of prayer that he focuses on include praying for the wider church, praying for others, praying with the end in mind or the end of heaven, praying for transformation and praying in line with God's promises. And all of this, I think, gave me a broader vision of prayer than, it can be easy to falling into just asking God for what we want in our lives or in even that day. And so it was a much broader application of prayer and a broader understanding of prayer. And one thing that stood out to me was the relational nature of prayer, and prayer being one way that we experience the love of God. As J.I. Packer writes, praying is the active exercise of a personal relationship. And the book dwelt on God's character and how, for example, when we reflect on his generosity and also his sovereignty, this is actually should lead us to prayer. So it should be a call to prayer. The other thing is that even when we don't feel like our prayers are being answered in the way that we want, that we should be persistent in prayer. And he writes, so that we may exercise our faith and pursue him with sincerity, because God is wise and disposes of all things according to his sovereign goodness. So all of this was very encouraging to me. It has, I guess, invigorated my prayer, and I would recommend it if you're at all interested. That was Praying with Paul by Don Carson. Thanks for listening, guys. I have some more exciting video concepts that I have come up with, and I'm excited to film in the coming months. And thank you for being patient with me during my absence. Not that I don't think anyone cared too much, but for my mom, who kept asking me when my next video would be, here it is. And I'm excited to see you guys and talk to you guys again soon.